Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about something that is really important to me and has really changed my life, and that is Jenkum.
There's a new way for your kids to get high. They're using raw sewage.
I couldn't imagine doing something like that. Sounds pretty sick to me.
Honestly, they need to find something better to do with their life. Seriously.
Something new, something stimulating, something different.
There's a lot of people that say it's a hoax or it's not real or it's just made up or whatever. Now let's just get this out of the way first, so you can laugh it all off or whatever, You won't be laughing once you experience what I have and have your life change. But, it's human waste. It's, shit.
So before you lose your train of thought, I don't want to cut you off, but you said there's a lot there to unpack. But if you have any thoughts about that closing bit, by all means.
Yeah, so I think the main thing that I would say is that I do understand what you're getting at, where there's a different sort of racism involved. I guess my own spin or add there is that essentially, when I look at a lot of these things, what I'm seeing is that we have these two parties, Democrats and conservatives. It's still a white or Democrats and Republicans. It's still a white majority country. The majority of both parties are white. Most people who can get involved in politics, much like most people who can get involved in activism, have to be reasonably well off, at least stable middle class. Mm-hmm. It's all going in that one direction. These parties need some way to differentiate themselves from each other. For Democrats, the main way, even though on paper, across certain demographics, they are mostly white and they're mostly from the same classes and they mostly go to the same schools, the one way that they can sort of attach themselves onto a more radical vision is to connect themselves to poor non-white communities. The reality, several realities happening at the same time is because of how our education system works, because of how our economy works, colleges are not going to be able to just send you a bunch of poor Black people to become friends with who can also be your colleagues in Congress.
Right.
So that's not going to happen. Also, the realities of the things that we were talking about, how poverty affects you. It's not going to be easy for you to just decide to take on your own, elevating someone to that standard, changing someone's life who's starting from nothing. It's actually really, really difficult and much more of this will probably take decades. And if we're talking at the public policy level, this is a generational effort to uplift people to a position where they can just start running for office. So you're left with this dilemma where it's you need to make yourself appear different than the other party, even though you're the same race, same class, same education level, and you want to appear like you have a radically different vision. One option is that you can grab all the middle and upper class Black people who the economy and the education system naturally sends your way and who, because they grow up similar to you, even though they're Black, and we talk all the time on the left and liberals, race is a construct. Well, if race is a construct, then their actual living situations, their class is going to affect their personalities. And lo and behold, middle and upper class Black people have a lot of shared values with middle and upper class white people, particularly when they're liberal. Mm-hmm. And if you combine that with not actually having to talk to any of the Black poor, you set up the situation where it's oh, we're completely different from the other white, rich, Ivy-educated white people. Listen to this Black guy. And it turns out we were right the whole time. Listen to this person speak for all the Black people. It turns out all of the Black poor that are right there at the bleeding edge of the worst that America has to offer, they also agree with everything our party says. Right. If you never have to actually talk to the Black poor, you've given yourself a ton of rhetorical power. You don't actually have to negotiate with these people who really, if you were to talk to them, have a very complicated set of political ideas and affiliations. It's like any other poor group where it's there's certain things about them that lean conservative, because I'll just throw religion out there. That's the most obvious one.
Sure, yeah.
The poor Black
very big, very religious.
Very religious. At the same time,
Black communities.
Yeah. At the same time, they are aware even if they don't know the exact dates and exact, in this case, I'm talking about, Black people who are very, very young. They're aware that racism can lead to like the worst that life offers, which is physical violence that won't be punished. And so very often, in a way, they're single issue voters. At least these people, if they are racist to me, it's in that passive aggressive, polite way that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
And I can kind of handle that. What I don't want is to cede an inch of ground to people who might be willing to engage in violence against me, or at least might be willing to not punish people who engage in violence against me. Because when you are raised poor, you mostly think in terms of who's going to do something fucking terrible to me.
Yeah, where are the fires?
Yeah.
Where are the fires? Yeah.
So if all this group can promise me is protection from at least one fire, even if we have nothing else in common, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
And so you have
that's an interesting rationalization of where a lot of Black people get swayed, even if they fundamentally disagree with a lot of what the left is offering or might execute in terms of like the fine detail or the fine print. That as long as they promise for you not to get set on fire, so to speak, correlating it to the analogy, then that's enough. That's all that matters.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
And the other side,
not a high bar, but it is.
And the other, and then to understand the other side's perspective is like, well, it's your job to stay away from the fires. Then it's like, well, that offers me nothing. Again, if you're that single issue voter, where they go, well, it's your own personal responsibility to avoid fires. You're just like, ugh. Well, that fucking sucks because that's the one thing that I need you to help me with, and you're telling me I'm on my own, so you offer me nothing.
Yeah, I would say, and I told you, I care about the end result. I care less about which ideology gets to pat itself on the back at the end of history. I really don't give a shit. But if there was ever a conservative movement where they found some way to balance their desire to be proud of America while also being able to, I guess, acknowledge without flinching, and I'm not talking about appeasing the liberals that you see in, say, pop cultural, like I'm not talking about appeasing or assuaging the fears of the most visible liberal segment. I'm talking about appeasing the ordinary folks who are actually on the ground. If they ever got to a point where they could balance their desire to be proud of American exceptionalism with the ability to mention shitty parts of American history without what appears to many Black people like a kind of flinch effect, like a kind of like, I don't really want to do it, it would change the landscape entirely.
Well, I think you have to be willing to look at, you have to be willing to look at our history critically and patriotically. You have to be able to do both. By the way, no matter which side you're on, because I could easily come back and play devil's advocate and say, well, they do that on the left, but the opposite way, where they are unable to accept that some of the things that you could be critical of in our history might actually lead to what makes this country so great to begin with, right? Like, and one of the examples I talked about on the last one of the last podcasts I did was Dave briefly brought up in this new special. He referenced a guy named William Ellison, who I actually talk about in my act, who was a freed slave who became a Black slave owner and ended up becoming one of the largest plantation owners, one of the primary financiers of the Confederacy. And, there's not a lot of documentation or history on him. So the belief is that he's just this sort of traitorous freed Black slave who hated Black people and hated slaves and et cetera. But what a lot of people don't understand about that time in the Civil War is a lot of the abolitionist movement in terms of publications were actually British nationalists, like people who believed the Civil War would eventually bankrupt America and put us back into debt with the Bank of England and allow the colonies, the United States, to be reabsorbed into Great Britain as a territory. And so nobody ever stops to think perhaps guys like William Ellison and the many other people in the South were essentially fighting for what they believed was a necessary part of keeping America independent, and allowing us to be a country continuing forward and having an independent economy, versus that it was just racism and just hatred, right? And so I think both sides are guilty of not being able to look at the patriotism and criticize the things that were wrong. Like, I think we can all objectively agree that all slavery is bad, that it's all problematic, and that essentially it should go away. We also, none of us lived in that time. None of us knew what was at stake or even could comprehend what people felt like was at stake. So if at the time, those people in the South felt like the alternative is essentially losing the country or fighting for this thing that's kind of ugly but necessary, which they thought at the time it was, it gives you a different perspective. So I think both sides have a difficulty of going, like, the left has a complete inability to look at that struggle, that time in American history, with any objectivity. They have an inability to look at it as anything other than hatred towards a race of people that are being utterly dehumanized. And people on the right, a lot of them try to ignore that was a primary function or a primary byproduct of that time as well. So it's like, back to the discussion of nuance, there's a lot of nuance to these things when you talk about them and you share that perspective. The best attack against that, I feel like, is a lot of people with a lot of different education and a lot of different perspective being able to get into spaces and communicate and talk without this feeling of like, well, if you share this perspective, even as devil's advocate, as to offer something different, then it says this about you, and you're a horrible person, and you're part of this group, and everybody that's part of that group is also horrible, and you now represent them and their beliefs. We have this very dismissive way of not hearing other people out because of the groups we ascribe them to, and that, to me, gets us away from becoming a more evolved America than a more unified one.
I think I would say that, similar to your example of the black slave owner, there is a question of what terrible things are you willing to allow happen in favor of something good?
Yeah.
So the person that you're describing is, I assume, having read abolitionist writing, like people often, make it seem like we're thousands of years evolved from those humans. Those humans were capable of detecting the very same issues with slavery that we detect now. And you can look at the writing and see many people making the exact same arguments. This person made a calculation that amount of suffering and pain is acceptable if it keeps the country together.
Right.
That's, people have to make their decision, and they will be judged on that basis. For many, I'll say, liberal activists or liberal speakers, there is this thought that any return to the previous America would just be so terrible and so tragic that whatever you have to do to get that probability as close to zero as possible is worth doing. And I'm not saying that I make that choice, but I understand these things, similar to your description of the South, as people deciding that there are certain things that are so terrible that you'll abandon anything else to avoid it.
Right. Yeah. And that's sort of the idea, right? Like, at the time, there were probably people who said, yeah, this is morally wrong, but it's also the only way we can survive as a country. And there are a lot of times, I'm sure, throughout history, we can find examples where people
I assume it's pretty common.
Yeah. And there were a lot of times where people were faced with things that they had to decide, is this what's best for the greater good or what isn't? And there were a lot of times, I think, throughout history, that most of the time we get it wrong, right? Or it's not perfect.
Yeah. I would say, wrong.
Yeah, there's a lot of times we get it wrong. But it's kind of hard to ever examine the opposite, because we can't go back. We can't run it back. You know what I mean? Like, we can't go back and go, well, and this is the argument I'll always have with people when I talk about American exceptionalism is, what if never having slavery at all in this country meant, and this is a fun hypothetical I do with my black friends all the time, is like, what if never having slavery in this history at all meant that the country never became what it is? Like, what if that was, in a butterfly effect sense of things, what if that was a necessary evil for America to be this place that allows you now to have utmost freedom, utmost success, transformational wealth, whatever? Like, what if without it, we were just another mid-level to poverty-stricken nation? what would you say? And so, you know, it's interesting the answers you'll get to that question, but no one ever considers that the people of that time also felt the same way or were thinking the same thing of like, well, this is a horrible thing, but what if it's the only way we'll get to what we all want? And it's just a fun exercise to kind of do with people, to say that like not everything has the benefit of looking back. Like you don't always have the benefit of looking back and going, well, we could have done this. And then it's like, but you have no idea what that ripple effect would have been and what that would have changed for the America we live in today.
Well, I also think part of the issue there is that if you're going to do the thought experiment, you should be as literal to the current American situation as possible. So, you know, it's a different thought experiment if we're having that in a hypothetical America where all the surplus of America and all of its greatness and all the things that it's accomplished have been equally divvied out, and each of us are sitting in the same position saying, wasn't it worth it? It's a very different thought experiment if you're being very, very literal and you're looking at the people who generation after generation have been, say, born to impoverished families. And it's kind of like, what's the game?
Well, yeah, to me, the only thing is like when you look at the amount of prosperity America has to offer for all people comparative to other nations. So forget about how that breaks down socioeconomically inside of America. Just the ceiling isn't higher anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. For me, just as an individual, if the end result for me is the same, then I'm not that moved by where the ceiling is.
Right.
If I'm, you know, and I'll switch over to white Americans so much, or how much money Bill Gates makes, it doesn't typically make you less poor.
No, and that's the thing is like when we talk about sort of this idea of transference of wealth or trickle down economics, I mean, there's still the thing about choice, right? Like, well, those economics only trickle down based on the choices of the wealthy. And if the wealthy doesn't choose to create companies and create jobs or create opportunities with that money, if they decide to spend it and go to fucking space, you know, then the concept of trickle down doesn't work or doesn't exist. There's also a point, you know, you have to be, and so obviously maintaining people's freedom of choice is so important to me as a libertarian, but you also have to understand that there is what's called a point of diminishing returns, where there's a level of wealth that some people achieve where there's nothing more they can do in the world as they continue to amass and accumulate wealth. Like we used to deal with this from a labor perspective, right? When dealing with businesses. So I was an operations manager for many years. And one of the companies I worked for, they divvied up their labor based on a percentage of revenue. It was the same everywhere. So they said everybody gets the same percentage of their revenue in terms of labor. Well, what you run into is there are only so many jobs to be done throughout the hours of operation throughout the day. And so the richest of the rich never spend to their budget because they can't. They could literally station someone at every job for all day and not even touch the percentage. And then the poorest, the stores that make the least, don't even have enough to staff their business to ever be able to grow it because their service levels are low because they're adhering to a budget, and they can never grow their business because their service levels are low. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in a weird way, we came up with almost a socialized construct to help improve the capitalistic nature of our business, meaning once a business hits the point of diminishing returns, the excess is then filtered into the lower tiered businesses to help them grow, to allow them to have the staffing and the service levels to exponentially grow their business. And that's what we run into in America is the problem with straight up individualism and straight up everybody has to do for themselves is that once money hits the point of diminishing returns, it's hard for the poor to stop being poor because the things you need to do to get out of poverty take money. You need to go to school. You need to do these things. So it's like, at what point can we take the money that's in excess of diminishing returns, meaning you can never spend it and anything you spend it on will have no effect on society? Then how do we recycle that back in? That's not a sort of just a handout, right? Because it's not like we gave these stores the money and said, spend it however you want. We said, you can only spend it on labor. You can only give people hours and station them in the business. And then these are the behavioral things we have to do to make sure you're spending that money wisely. We can do that in the country. The problem is that we are willing to take from the rich, but we're not willing to do all the work to make sure that it's affecting the poor the way that it needs to. And that has been the problem with American liberalism for the last 50 years, is that we love to say, we're going to take this money and we're going to throw it at poverty. But the reality is we don't really see where it lands, and we don't follow up to make sure that it's doing what it's intended to do. And so the poor stay poor, the rich get richer, and the people that are politicians stay in power because on the surface, they're doing the right thing. They're taking the excess and they're giving it to those that need it. But there is no real trail of like, is that landing and is it being effective?
So, and I would say this, that just for, being a good sport and admitting when I haven't fully cited something from the other side, I would say that there's probably instances where conservatives or people on the right can make this same case. But I'll make it for the left right now. When we look back in the history, it's very hard to treat any of these instances of giving money to the poor as a laboratory experiment. And there's no moment where both sides were like, you know what? You won. Let's do it your way. Here's the length of time. And I'm not going to try and thwart you while it happens.
Right.
We're going to decide together. This is about how long we think it would take to have an effect. We're going to see that. And like a bunch of scientists, if it doesn't, we're going to move on afterwards. So at these distinct points where we say that we were throwing money at the poor, there wasn't an agreement. There was somebody who said, like, we shouldn't even do that act of throwing money at the poor. And then once the money was being thrown, there were more people who didn't, Americans don't have this history of just accepting it on the chin. They continued to fight and undermine and do all these things that, for us looking back historically, fuck up the experiment. None of us gets to point to a policy and say, like, you remember that time that we actually just tried to do the policy, gave it a specific time of life, and no one tried to fuck it up before it could get there? Well, American politics is so faddish that we don't have any of those clean examples.
Well, that's the problem with the mechanisms of government. The other problem is politicians don't have to live in the world that they legislate and create. So, that could be very well, it can't be fixed. And this is the hard reality. None of these things we talk about can be fixed in the America with the government system that we have today. The one thing we could do that would change it is we could absolutely change the way Congress is structured. And what I mean by that is like eliminate elections when it comes to Congress. Like if congressional, which is representative government by population, if that was selected like jurors, we'd have a much better cross-section of people. And if that is the legislative branch of government or the entry-level legislative branch of government, it would make the most sense for that to be the most true cross-section of America. Meaning you get a summons, you go in, you take a couple of tests, and then the people in the room vote on the people that they think are the best for the job, and then those are your congressmen and women for the next 2 years, and then it changes every 2 years. You actually have an incentivized arm of Congress that says, all right, well, we're here for 2 years. We do the best we can do for everybody, but then we're going to be right back out living in that world. So let's try to do the thing that actually is good for everybody. And if we changed government to that structure, and then if you decide you love it and you want to stay in government, then you run for Senate, then you run for governor, then you go be president. But Congress is something you don't get elected to. It's something you get drawn for. You have to serve. I don't think people should have to pay income tax in the 2 years that they do that. And then essentially it's like a government service. And so you can't ever be drafted again. You can't be picked again. But essentially what that would do is you'd have a guy who was homeless, who went into a room, and if that motherfucker had good ideas and everyone in the room was like, I actually like the homeless guy, that guy gets to be a congressman for 2 years. And that could, again, transition him from one leg of economics to another, and potentially open all kinds of doors. The idea that we could randomize to some extent that chamber of our government, that could disrupt everything in a way that would be very, very positive moving forward.
So I'll throw one thing out there.
Can't be done without war, by the way, because those people will never cede those positions of power peacefully.
This is not an area I've gotten to study much, but it's something that I'm open to that I'll just say, because I'm assuming that you've gotten to say this idea before and that some of your audience might be interested in it. But I know that there's been a ton of work done on lottery systems in comparing it to, like, what if we did a lottery system for who gets research grants? What would that look like? And most of the time, these arguments show that we're so bad at picking where the good ideas are going to come from that a lottery and a random probability on our side would probably do better than our attempts to pick where the winners are.
Yeah.
So in that sense, very amenable to that idea. I'll also say that if I had to brand myself in an ideological camp, which I am super hesitant to do, because I'm kind of a person where it's like, well, here's what I'd love, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. So I'm not going to think that way. But I have.
That's the problem with American politics, by the way, is that everybody thinks inside the confines of that structure. Like, we're not going to change the way we function as a society under this system. We have to start thinking about ways to change it. And I'm not saying that to be critical. I'm just saying that that's why it's never happened, is because at some point everyone gets to that point that you just did and said, well, we're not going to change this system. Well, why not? The problem is we're not going to change it without war. That's the problem. Is it's going to take some sort of interventionism to change the structure of how we govern this country.
So, great thing to call me out on, and I will add a nuance there because I was being a little bit flippant. So I have an anarchist sensibility in the mode of Noam Chomsky. So what you described about this random service and people just come in and they can't, I'd love it. It'd be great. The reason why, in some sense, that I don't think what I want, like the reason why I'm kind of bowing out in that sense, what I really should have said is like, I don't think other people like my ideal America. And because I'm so fiercely interested in people, in a democratic experiment, and most people getting to live the life that they want, as I meet other personalities, I'm like, yeah, I don't think you like the same anarchy that me and Noam Chomsky like. And I just have this kind of feeling, and I'm going to use a really dumb example, but to me, my approach to a lot of democratic issues is like, if we were at a house party and we're ordering pizza and like 7 out of the 10 want pepperoni, I'm the guy who's just like, they should get pepperoni then. I don't know that I like it, but I want them to get the thing that they're voting for. And I know that this gets way messier because obviously you're going to get into like majority-minority dynamics and whether or not the majority is always going to crush the minority and ruin them in all these terrible ways. But barring all that, my dream situation is one where it's like, I'm just a fucking team player, I guess is the way I would say it. And I, within reason, would be willing, like, if most of you like this system, and this is assuming you've had the chance to actually express that and act on it, then within reason, I'll just fucking go with it because I like the other parts of the country.
And what you describe right now is like the cancer of America, meaning like there's always a level of comfort that none of us are willing to trade for what is right. And so for you in that pizza scenario, being the disruptor is more of a discomfort than getting the pizza you want. Well, and so you make a choice.
I think for politics, a lot of this conversation of what is right, because you're flagging me on choosing this over doing what's right. In this situation, I'm assuming that in the area of what humans would like their lives to be like, this is getting closer to an opinion conversation.
Sure.
It's a conversation of right and wrong. And I'm saying I'm putting my support behind the majority of people getting to live a life that they would actually like.
Right.
I'm saying that if it turns out that my ideal would be your fucking hellscape and I'm in the minority, I'm not the type of person who would try and find some way to force you to live in my ideal. That just doesn't work for me.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, though, in that analogy, the way America is now is that the pepperoni guy is going to try to tell everybody else in the room that if they don't like pepperoni, or I'm sorry, the pepperoni is the majority, right? So if they do like pepperoni, they're probably secret pedophiles. So it's like that is the problem with minority thinking in America, is that people there's almost like this intent to discredit the majority, or where everyone's leaning for what they think is the greater good. There's like this attempt to subvert it, like you said earlier, rather than saying like, all right, well, why don't we just agree to try this for a while, see what it says, and put some stipulations in place to say these are the ways that we're going to measure whether or not this is successful. We don't really experiment with government that way because of elections. Because we have that concept of elections. I mean, look how much time politicians spend just staying in office, campaigning for re-election, campaigning for election. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of their money that just goes to waste every year because they're actually not doing the job. They're actually keeping the job. Imagine if your boss left work every day for 3 hours and said, I'm going to spend 3 hours making sure I don't get fired. And you're like, well, actually, maybe the best way to do that is to stay here and do the fucking job. And that's not actually the way our government works now at all. So that's kind of the problem.
I have full support for that idea, and I will bring some element of good, bad, or right and wrong ethic into this. You look at certain polls where we're just doing surveys of what Americans would like things to be. Like, you can find out whether or not Americans think money should go to support free lunch for low-income preschools. That's very easy data to come by. It is an issue. It is a failing to me if you've decided what you want and you do nothing to try and pursue it, even when you know most people actually are on your side and they would like that.
Yeah,
that is a weird situation where you do
tough.
All sorts of surveys and you'll see things like 70 to 80% of Americans all agree that they would like this to happen. And so even once we know everybody agrees with this, we are hesitant to try and make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and then now there's the question of, like, can we even trust the data when that information comes in? I mean, and again, the randomization of government, I think, would help remove a lot of the mistrust. The idea that the people that are doing it, at least in one of the chambers, have been chosen against their will. Ultimately, you know, I think there would be some sense of peace of mind about that. You know, at least that they don't necessarily have a nefarious end game, because they couldn't, because we would limit those terms and people would go in and serve their time, and that's that.
Well, I think we have I don't know how anyone generates a new culture or adds a new element to culture, but our ability to be good losers has kind of dissipated, and I think part of that is, you know, people always throw this word around, polarization. But I think it applies here, where it's like, there was a time, I guess I would say, or at least when I look at history or when I watch like old firing line videos with William F. Buckley, you know, famous conservative, talking to other folks, where we thought it seemed like the sides thought even if the other person lost, the world that they would create for 4 years would at least be tolerable. Mm-hmm. Now we seem to be in a space where, like, we're really quite sure if the other side wins, we will be living in an intolerable hellscape. And I'm not saying we're right about that perception, but that seems to be how things are looked at, where it's like,
well, it's how people campaign, and it's how elections are won and lost. I mean, you know, you see it happen all the time, where people go, well, people didn't really vote for so much for Joe Biden. They voted against what they thought America would be like with 4 more years of Trump. So you kind of see that manifest in the way people talk about politics. And I do think people vote that way now too. Like, and there are a lot of people now that, like, voted for Joe Biden that are looking at the country going, what the fuck happened? And, you know, they're having almost like a buyer's remorse, so to speak. And it's like, well, but you made the choice based off of voting against what you thought was the lesser of two evils. And then you realize that both might have been too evil. Like, your lesser of two evils might have still also been too fucking shitty. And now you're stuck with that as a reality. And so, you know, that's one of the things I want to get away from in American politics, is this idea of, like, and it's maybe why I was critical of your, I'll just go along with the whatever, if everybody wants pepperoni, is because now we've gotten to this point where everybody is like lesser of two evils, rather than fighting for what is altruistically the end goal, the end result we all want. And now it's like, we'll just take, it's almost like saying, well, getting to a point where nobody gets raped is impossible, so let's just try to make the rapes as pleasant as, you know what I mean? And it's just like, no, fundamentally we should be eliminating this thing from our society, not trying to make it as comfortable as it can be. And I do think comfort-based you know, compromise is sort of, it's the enemy of getting to the best end result. And we live in a society now that almost rewards that. It's a big part of why I'm resented in my pursuit of what I do, is because those who have chosen comfort over passion, or those who have chosen comfort over what makes them ultimately the most happy, will always carry resentment for people who are divergent in that regard. Like, people who are willing to be uncomfortable for what they ultimately think is their purpose, or what they ultimately think is right, will always be enemies to those who don't have the bravery or courage to do it. And so it's difficult. Like, I'm sure you probably experienced this, going from a place of abject poverty to going to college. You're like, oh, look at college boy over here. Oh, you're going to go to college, you're going to be better than everybody. It's like, it's sort of that mentality of crabs in the bucket. And until we can evolve out of that, which I don't think is possible, we have to build systems in place that get us away from functioning in that space of like, well, I do whatever it takes not to upset the community, because, you know, we can't change it until we do that.
So I just want to jump on that pepperoni example, just because I know that that could be misleading. I'll put it to people, and I'm fine having a weird psychology. I've been weird most of my life. I'm a token and an outlier now, and you don't get to be any of those without being weird. So I'm fine with that. I wrote my piece because I, in part, was being told constantly through a million different streams that a critical mass of Americans wanted the situation for the Black poor to be improved. And because I was made aware that that was their desire, but I could see that that empathy was being squandered because it wasn't actually doing that. And they had made it clear that they wanted that. I took the time to write a piece that illuminated the ways in which that wasn't happening.
It was being squandered.
It was being squandered. Now, in an alternative where they're aware that the poor are poor and they're just like, we don't give a fuck. Well, I wouldn't write that piece.
Right.
Because they've already expressed that they don't give a shit. And that's what I'm getting at with the me being responsive to, in situations where people do make their desires known. I guess I have a hard time supporting a politics that is authoritarian in the sense of, I see a lot of people who, politically speaking, they're quite sure that nobody wants what they're offering. And they're quite sure that if everyone got a voice or if everyone got to participate, they would lose.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why anyone who's not a psychopath would want to usher in a system that most of the other humans don't fucking want. So that's what I'm trying to get at with the pepperoni thing. I think in real life, we're not really given too many chances to say like, oh, this is exactly the America top to bottom that we would like, and then see if people move in that direction. But hypothetically, when we're talking about things like anarchy or libertarianism or any of that, we're describing like our deep, deep rooted philosophies. I want to know the world that people want to live in, because I don't think there's a point to living unless you are living a life that you actually fucking like. And I agree. Many people to have a point to living as possible. And I think we're just lucky that humans, being the same species, there's so much overlap in what we think makes a life worth living. Not perfect overlap, but just enough where it's like, there's probably big columns where it's like, going back to a very early point for us, we can agree probably that most people genuinely do want a house, and the people are like, no, fuck that, I don't need a house. Well, you're kind of an outlier. I don't know if we should let you dictate policy for the rest of us who really just don't.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
On our heads.
That's true. Yeah, and that could lead to a pretty ineffective government. But when we say that it should be representative, maybe it also needs to be representative of those crazies and those outliers, because that's how we, you know.
I think there should be a, if we're talking like ethically, and I think that's the way to go, I do think that there's a conversation to be had about what's the worst thing you can do to the person you beat in a democratic election? What, like, how bad are you willing to allow being on the losing side? For me, I'm not a vindictive or vengeful or petty person. So it's kind of like, if I beat someone or if my side wins an election, I don't really need to further disparage, dismantle, harm them, use my power to wreak terrible things upon them. But there's other people where it's like, that's what they're hoping to get out of power, is not just to win, but to really demolish the people that they beat.
Well, you're getting into the construct of like, the problem with these positions is that the people that want them are seeking that power, and there's really never a good reason to seek it. You know, we have this idea. Which your
randomization would help with.
Right. You're almost saying those who, you know, are, my camera's messing up. It gives you a safeguard against people who seek that power for the wrong reasons. And arguably, I would say under the current system, there's no way to seek that power for the right reasons at all. Like, there's only those who seek those things for the wrong reasons. And, you know, how do you defend against that? Having some randomized chamber of government is one idea. I'm sure there could be other ways, but that to me is the biggest problem, is that like everybody in those positions everybody that has that job wants it. And, you know, the real people who are disruptors in companies and stuff all the time are the people who don't want to fucking be there. And sometimes those people have great ideas. And so, you know, it is sort of like the only way you can really sort of disrupt that system of oppression and that system of control is to truly just disrupt it.
So I'm just going to highlight something for your audience, even though I think they were smart enough to discern this, but I just want to call it out. I come from like a really apolitical background, even though we often talk about how poor blacks or poor whites vote. Just in case anyone's never looked it up before, the poor generally don't vote that much. It's just not at all a common cultural thing. So whatever you're looking at, it's mostly not the making of the poor. And I come from that background where like people don't really talk about poverty. So I'm sorry, not that people don't talk about poverty. People talk about poverty. They don't talk about politics. And I don't come from like a rich political tradition. And even when I got into this space, I know that politics and policy is how these things are solved. But I guess I made my focus much simpler for me because I was at a kind of this space of like, well, just being a human with ordinary emotions, poverty looks deplorable, and it was a deplorable experience for me. And I have enough awareness to deduce that it seems like a lot of these people would like to do something about it. And I can also tell from the numbers, even without learning anything about politics or ideology or reading great political theory, that their efforts are being squandered. And so that's how I got most of the way to where I am. But I think sometimes people imagine, not that you did this, this is just for the listeners, people imagine that I was probably reading a lot of political theory books or really developing a robust politics or policy preference along the way. It's like, nope, I stuck purely to observing and describing something that seemed like understandable, even with my lack of great political theory knowledge.
Well, yeah, and I came into some of the same understanding of what you wrote about myself just from being in the business and in sort of experiencing this this sort of like othering on the other way of like saying like, well, we're going to go like I literally, and when I was quote unquote canceled for the straight white male comment in 2018, like my experience at that time was walking into rooms and people going like, we're literally not buying or looking to sell any straight white male stories. And I thought like, what a reductive way to look at somebody's life or their story or their experience is just to deduce or to reduce it down to those three monikers. And in a weird way, it was like, okay, but now you're saying the motivation is to tell what? Like sexually divergent ethnic stories, but you're not really accomplishing that either because the pool you're pulling from are like you're pulling people of color and gay people from the same clubs I'm not allowed in, right? So it's like you're saying that you're making this industry more inclusive, but you're actually just sort of like it's almost in a weird way industrial blackface, meaning like we're just taking the same story and we're painting a black face on it, a gay face on it, a Latino face, whatever you want to call it, but you know, and so it was interesting to see that kind of come along, and it was really cool to read your article and to see somebody kind of spell it out and go, this isn't just a feeling. These are the real actual examples of these people and where they come from.
And I just want to add one thing to that diversity concept. I do think that being Black and middle class is a particular experience that if you're deciding that your art is going to be something that people should not just interpret as art, but also as in some way truthful. If you're making that claim as an artist, not every artist does. Some artists are like, this is pure entertainment, folks, so take it at face value. Mm-hmm. But some people like to link their art to political value. I do think that there is a middle-class Black experience that you could write about. I think there is a white middle-class experience that would be divergent in some ways. I think there is a Southern white experience and a Southern Black experience in those same classes. It's the proportions that I think in part are way, way off in these initiatives where they have more than enough of the middle-class Black, white, Asian, Hispanic perspective. They have tons of it. For me, the way to go wouldn't be like, we don't need any more straight white males creating ever.
Right. Right.
Because there's whole categories of white males where it's like, yeah, I don't remember all these shows that were written by like poor white South Philadelphians. I don't remember that moment in.
Well, one of the most
history.
successful comedies of all time is from a poor white trashy Philadelphian called "It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia." And when I say most successful, I mean it's run 16 seasons.
Yeah.
And so while it's not critically acclaimed, it is a very much a, it's definitely a financial success for that network. And a lot of people would say it's undoubtedly.
And he just brought his friends on. I just got to bring that up.
Yeah, they just all made it themselves, and they refused to give any control to anyone else because they knew that it would get molested. It would get deconstructed from what it was intended to be. Because again, you cannot hand the narrative of that narrative. You can't hand the handling of that narrative over to somebody who doesn't understand it. Like they're not going to like. Great example is like when I hand somebody a piece of my work and they go, I don't get why this is funny. It's like, well, then you're not the right person to represent it or to work with it, because it's funny to the people it's funny to. And that's the thing about funny is it is very culturally segregated in the sense that, and I don't mean racially, I mean culturally, meaning like there are certain types of people that get certain kinds of comedy. And then they're like the New Yorker isn't for everybody, right? But there is a readership and a viewership of people that get it and like it. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. That doesn't mean it's not funny. That doesn't mean it's anything. It just means that it's not for everybody. Well, all comedy is not for everybody because everybody has wildly different experiences and a wildly different perspective that informs on their sense of humor or what they think is funny. But to say that one has more merit than the other is like you're sort of getting away from, like I said, the meritocracy of comedy of like that show didn't do well. It's Always Sunny. Because it spoke to a historically, or what the left views as a historically marginalized group, although it is the first, like as a Philadelphian, I look at that and I go, these are the kind of trash decisions me and my friends would make in the same circumstances. So that's why it's funny to us. I don't think a lot of people find it funny for the same reasons, but it doesn't mean they don't find it funny for their own reasons. There's a lot of people that probably watch that show and go, oh my God, could you imagine being like this? This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But so it doesn't necessarily have to be first person relative for somebody to enjoy something. You know what I mean? But that's not a bad thing. And that's the thing of like, that's the one pushback I had against Chappelle in the early 2000s when he walked away from Chappelle's show. And he said, well, part of the reason I wanted to leave is because I felt like a lot of people were laughing at the things in the show for the wrong reasons. And I understand that, but it's like that is an inevitability of comedy. You can't control why people find something funny. What you can understand, though, is that once you have them, you can feed them anything you want to feed them. So while I think a young Dave Chappelle looks at that and goes, I don't like this because I don't want white people laughing at my show for the wrong reasons. I think mature Dave Chappelle now would go, I don't care if that's why they start liking it, because eventually I will give them some stuff to think about that might change them. And, I think it took Dave walking away from that to have that self-realization to say that actually might have been the best thing to do, was to get people that are laughing for the wrong reasons and then change the way they view the world.
So, and I'll say that this is the minority view, but I'll put it this way. There are some people who have to watch everything that happens in popular culture because they're of the opinion that humans, to a very large degree, are, tabula rasa. We start out as a blank slate, and we are pulled in different directions based on what we're exposed to. And for many of the people involved in arts and creative things, part of the importance that they are able to suggest their work has is that they're part of shaping people. And on the one hand, this makes art, seem important, seem very vital, makes it seem like it has meaning beyond just being entertaining. It's shaping people. It's changing how they ultimately end up. On the other hand, that is the motivation for censorship. It is the fear that exposure to the wrong thing will take humans in this direction that we don't want them to have. Me personally, I remember, growing up in the 90s, and I remember all the attempts they tried to do in terms of studying whether violence in video games makes you more violent, or if it just turns out that people who are already violent kind of like playing violent video games. Are the people who listen to death metal being turned a certain way? Are the people watching WWE turned a certain way? And again and again and again, the research showed that the ability to shape people was fairly minimal, that if you did a personality test on them at a certain point, they didn't really get pulled in that many directions. I'm suspicious of the idea that comedy or any of these things is really shaping people in this way, where it's like, to make this concrete, I don't think if all of the comedians shared the same point of view, their comedy would then lead all of the audience that had a different point of view to go that way. One of the things I think about is like, there were so many people who were sure that Trump wasn't just allowing people with shitty opinions to behave shitty, that he was giving them their shitty opinions. He was inculcating that in them. But I remember when he got removed, not removed, he didn't get removed from power, but when his position ended, and there were certain groups who felt like, why isn't he coming to, forgive us for whatever we've done? I want to say one of the folks, or some of the representatives from, what's that Gavin McInnes club?
Oh, the Proud Boys?
The Proud Boys. When they felt like Trump had betrayed them, they didn't suddenly reevaluate their beliefs or go like, oh, I guess Trump really isn't that good. They just said like, oh, well, fuck that guy. And they kept the same beliefs that they had. And so a lot of times I think what I'm seeing is like, people find people who express their same beliefs that they already have. Mm-hmm. So me personally, I don't hold comedy up to the standard where it's like, you're actually shaping people. And if we could get all of you to not say things that seem even remotely prejudicial, that will end prejudice. I just think people who are inclined to prejudice will stop watching fucking comedy, and they'll find some other place that espouses their feelings.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree. I think you're 100% right. I just think I've always said like that my goal as a comedian, the most ambitious it can be, is to get you to question why you think something or how you think about something rather than what it is, or to try to change your mind to agree with me or disagree with me. My approach is always to sort of deconstruct what it is that people or how it is that they sort of think about things. So like a good example is I love to fight the audience with their own presumptions. So like I'll do a joke where I'll say like, I got to be honest, I'm super lazy. If it were legal, I would totally have slaves. And then the white people were in the audience will generally get uncomfortable, and I will point out to them, like, I just want to point out to you, I didn't say what color they'd be. You just guessed. And what's interesting about that often at the moment, if the room is nice and mixed, the black people automatically call that out. And they go, you fucking, yeah, you see, you guys picked us again. And then I'll go off on this completely silly random thing about that if we actually look at the job description, gay people would make the best slaves because their job is to stand out in the sunshine all day, pick out fabric. They're chained up to a bunch of other hot, sweaty, naked dudes. So it's like, you unpack this in this very nonsensical, silly way. But what I want somebody to walk away from is like, man, why did I think that? Or why was that the first thing that popped into my head? So it's sort of, it's in a way, it's like, it's trying to get them to acknowledge what you're saying is already a truth, which is that what they think is already there. I didn't put it there. I just reminded them that it was there. And then what they do with that information is up to them. Most people, I think, leave and they go, yeah, whatever. Some people, though, will walk away and go, man, why did I assume that? Or why did I think that? I'll give you an example that I experienced in my own personal life. When I was rideshare driving, I did it for many years, 2013, right up until the pandemic. And there was a time where I picked up a husband and wife from a nightclub, and they were getting physical in the back seat, and I immediately intervened. And I said, I was like, listen, if you guys keep doing this, I'm going to drive you right to the police station. Like, you guys can't be beating the shit out of each other in the car. So they were, this is obviously a problem. And it wasn't the man hitting the woman. It was like they were going back and forth. The woman initiated it. The guy was like pushing her back, but it was getting physical. I immediately intervened. They calmed down. They were talking shit to each other, and they were talking shit to each other in Farsi, which I understand a little bit of because that's what my girlfriend's family speaks. So I could pick up the part where he said, when we get home, I'm going to fucking kill you. And so I immediately picked that because, you know, that's what my girlfriend says to me all the time in Farsi. That's their love language is death threats. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, so I immediately, this is early Uber years. They didn't have the option to like send a request for help to a location with a 1-button push back then. So I dropped them off. I waited in the cul-de-sac in front of their house. I watched them walk up and continue talking. And at the same time, I'm calling the police. And luckily enough, the police show up literally within 10 seconds. Pretty affluent neighborhood. Within 10 seconds, there was a cop car rolling up silently behind me. And he was like, "Are you the guy who just called this in?" I was like, "Yeah." And it's probably an embellishment, but it was under a minute. And he rolls up and he goes inside and deals with the situation. So I go, cool, crisis averted. Whatever had to happen there is probably dealt with. Let's hope. Fast forward. So this is clearly a domestic situation where I recognize that this woman has to be protected. Then fast forward years later, I'm in a car. I pick up 2 gay guys, right? And they're arguing. They're talking shit to each other. And one guy is very large, very masculine, very big, muscular. The other guy, petite, talking a lot of shit. And the big guy says to the little guy, like, "If you keep telling me to shut up, I'm going to fuck you up." And I'm sitting there kind of like laughing. And the little guy's like, "Shut the fuck up. Just shut up." And he's talking shit. And all of a sudden, this dude reaches over and belts this guy in the fucking face. Right? And I don't say anything. I don't think anything. I'm in my mind. I'm kind of like laughing, like, he fucking told you to shut the fuck up. So as this happens, right? And then, of course, like they get out or whatever. I don't have the same reaction to this at all. And as they get out, I question, I go, wait a minute. Why was I okay with one and not okay with the other? What does that say about me? And is that right? And is that wrong? Now, obviously, it says that I have no, regardless of the sexual relationship between 2 people, I have no problem with men committing violence amongst themselves. And I do have a problem with a man committing violence against a woman. But that doesn't mean that it's right. And so it left me with this strange feeling of like, man, why do I think that? And is that unconscious bias affecting me in other parts of my life or in other parts of, you know, my day-to-day interactions with people? And so while I don't know that I would react differently or would do anything differently if the circumstances were presented again or whatever, that was an experience that kind of left me walking away going like, wow, there's obviously a difference in how I view those 2 things, whether it's conscious or not. And why is that? And I think that is the best we can do with art, is to get people to look at themselves and go, that's there. And then maybe if they further examine how they feel about that, that's on them. That work is on them. But art and comedy and all that stuff cannot aspire to do more than that, than to merely plant the seed. Does that make sense?
So that makes complete sense to me. And for my framing, what I'll say is like, because sometimes, you know, especially these days, every word that we use is so loaded with a variety of meanings that it's just like, it's so difficult to express anything because each of these are just so jam-packed. So a word like change, and what does it mean for a person to change? What I'll say is like, most of the things that I see that count as changing someone are removing ignorance so that a person can apply their standard set of emotions to new information that they didn't have. So in your example, you realized something about yourself, which is like, normally you're a person who doesn't advocate for partners to engage in physical violence, and you probably don't advocate for any humans to just go around doing that. Right. But when you're just running on autopilot, you're only looking for that when it's, you know, say a man and a woman, because of the as far as the way we understand it, greater potential for serious fucking damage. And you realize
it's not even that, but it's almost like this perception that there is an innocence to women that is concrete and persistent no matter what the circumstances are in which they should be protected. And quite frankly, if I'm being honest, why I didn't react the same way was because I felt like the guy talking shit brought it on himself. So what it made me unpack was like, wow, it's interesting how immediately we can excuse violence if it's justified, right? Like, and it talked to me a little bit more about our trauma response of like, well, you know, think about it this way of like, when we watched it's sort of like this, and it opened my eyes to like how our empathy receptors work. Did you see the video in Pennsylvania with the snow shoveling incident, the execution? So there were these two people, neighbors, arguing over shoveling snow into each other's driveways, and they were arguing and fighting, and then the one guy went into his house, got a gun, and executed the two people in the street. It was the most, it's good that you didn't see it, but it was the most horrific thing I've ever seen, and it stayed with me for like a week, maybe 2 weeks, and I couldn't shake it. And I was like, it made me like, it literally made my stomach turn. It was like watching two people being executed like dogs. I imagine it's how people feel if they watch like beheading videos. However, I then realized, like, what if that person that was executed was a pedophile? And I was thinking about like action movies. Like when we feel like that's the bad guy getting what's coming to them, it's amazing how it goes from this turns my stomach to like, fuck yeah, get that person. You know what I mean? And I was like, it's so interesting how we have like our sense of justice affects, my camera's being a real pain in the ass right now. Our sense of justice affects literally our response to violence. Like we are okay. We can compartmentalize how traumatic something violent might be if we think there's a moral justification for it versus if it seems like someone innocent is being attacked.
So, yeah, I think that something like comedy can cause you to do an inventory where you'll then sort through like your feelings in a few different situations and wonder like, why are there these contradictions or like moments where it's like, normally this would be appalling, but if I change one detail, suddenly it's not. Why is my...
Now I'm cheering for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it can create that sort of situation where you question things. I guess if I was going to try and amend my, not amend my statement, but it's just like, obviously it's easier to write about certain things than it is to discuss them. What I don't think comedy or other things can do is plant that sense of justice or the feelings that you're going to reference. It can help you decide like, oh, there's contradictions or tensions here. I've acknowledged that I behave differently in different situations, but whether or not you're going to look at that and be like, well, fuck, Josh, I'm normally a guy who doesn't really like violence and stuff like that. So going forward, now that I recognize that these situations are similar, I'm going to try and make my behavior more consistent. Or in another situation, someone's just like, oh yeah, I didn't think about it like that. I'm fine with the violence going in both situations.
Right, exactly. Yeah, well, it's the mentality of like, you can't change what's in the room. You can only turn the light on and off.
Gotcha. And I just, this is a moment of resonance. Like, I don't support this, but I totally know what you're getting at where like, and I don't know if it's just like I got used to it that way or, I'm inclined to think that it's just part of my personality. Won't shock anyone who just listened to what I said. But yeah, there's a real feeling to me that adults can, in a sense, almost contractually say yes to what comes next. Once you've been warned, if you keep going, then it's almost like you're agreeing. But I know that that's not, that way of doing things doesn't lead to anything else that I enjoy or like or value. So I try to ignore that, or I try to push back against that. But yeah, I've always been amenable to this idea like, well, yeah, there's at a certain point, if somebody hits you in the face, you had to have known that was possible.
Well, especially if they're warning you and you're ignoring the warning and you're just like, go ahead. And then it was like, well, he did try to tell you. So yeah, it was, and of course, like my methodology then as a comedian is to like, okay, so all right, if I discovered this thing about me and I don't know how I feel about it, but is anything funny about it? And so that's where you begin to mine. And some people are like, well, there's nothing funny about that, but that's not up to you to decide. That's up to me to decide. So
yeah, I will say on this note, there is, we've looked at like the value of comedy from a few different lenses. This is, I guess, a lens where it's not about the value of comedy itself. Exactly. But I guess there's a conversation being had over. So let's just imagine somebody who has a prejudice going in some direction. We're not going to be able to stop them from finding like-minded spaces, period. Like we're not going to be able to just pick them out and then ensure that they'll never find a magazine, an online forum, anything that will make them feel like their beliefs are okay. But there might still be a discussion about whether or not a space of social value, like, say, comedy or the arts, should be one of the places we allow them to find comfort. I don't have an opinion on that exactly, but I'm just bringing up the conversation to hear your thoughts, because it might be some people are like, yeah, we can't stop the actual person who hates the gays from laughing at your joke about being chained to sweaty bodies picking cotton. Like, we can't stop them from feeling that way and feeling like their views are being espoused, but we'd like to push them to where, like, a shittier art medium or a less prestigious art medium is the place they have to go to feel some sort of comfort in their views. We don't want something as socially prestigious as stand-up comedy to be the place where they find that sort of comfort.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so you're saying, like, yeah, I think the problem is that's an impossible thing to attempt to be the arbiter of. Like, you can't, it's like the thing of, like, you can't control who your fans are. And then you also can't say that, like, somebody who really does something great with that art medium, their value in the marketplace of ideas is not more important or maybe more valuable than somebody who uses it for hate. Like, there are people who watch the movie American History X and it reinvigorates their sense of white supremacy because of the way the movie ends. Where at the end of the film, the black kid kills the white kid anyway, because and the reality is he doesn't have any exposure to this white kid's gain of understanding that he was wrong, that he was living his life the wrong way, that his brother is now born again and understands the world in a different way. The black kid is just retaliating in the way that he felt necessary. The director, in my mind, I'm smart enough to go, the director is showing us that this is the problem with this situation, is that it's just one side of fear and hatred fueling the other side of fear of hatred, and it will be this perpetual cycle until we try to understand each other. And just because everyone is not as smart as I am, or that smart to be able to pull that message from the movie, doesn't mean that it should be removed from distribution, because some white people will watch that movie and go, she the fucking black guy murdered him anyway, and all the white supremacy is right. So like, there are going to be people that watch that and pull that away from it. But there are also, I think, people that are going to gain what I gain from it, is like, yeah, this polarization, this thing, like, if you choose to see it a certain way, it will fuel you that way forever. And, you know, nothing good will come of it. So I think you have to, this is the decision we have to make as a society, right? Is, do we govern and do we make decisions based off of what humanity's potential is? Or do we make decisions based off of what humanity has demonstrated it will most likely do? And maybe I'm a little bit naive or doughy-eyed in the sense of, like, I think we should always make choices based off of what is the best thing human beings can do with this, not could it be used for evil? Because there are a lot of great innovations throughout history that have been used for evil, and we don't decide to, like, get rid of them forever, because sometimes they could do some good. This is the same thing as the conversation with guns, right? Of like, well, you know, we should get rid of guns because a lot of bad things are done with guns. And it's like, yeah, but this country wouldn't exist without guns. And there are, you know, you can look at the analytics, but there are way more defensive uses of presenting a firearm in America than there are gun deaths every year. The problem is, it's kind of hard to say that the crime didn't continue because a gun was presented in a defense. But when those statistics are captured, the numbers are overwhelmingly good. So you could choose to pick that set of statistics and say guns protect more people than they ultimately hurt or kill. That's the problem with taking these. You can find a statistic to support any line of thinking that you want. I think you just have to look at things and go, are you going to make those choices off of thinking the best or hoping the best of people, or are you going to do it based off of, like, what is the worst case scenario?
I think also you've made a decision at base where you are utilitarian about those things. Like, some people, but I think some people, there are some things that some people don't even think about ever, where they go like, I don't even ever think about that. Specifically to the gun example, for, say, somebody who is moved by utilitarian arguments, then the fact that we can add up the defensive deaths versus the criminal ones and show a difference in these numbers directs what you're doing. For people with different frameworks, their main goal would be, how do I get as few deaths as possible?
No. I'm not talking about defensive deaths. It's interesting that that's what you took from that. I'm talking about the defensive use of firearm, which doesn't even necessarily result in the discharging of the firearm. It means how many times does a man follow a woman to her car? She presents a firearm and he leaves. So there's actually statistics that are kept about those, but it's only what's reported, obviously.
We don't have to use deaths. We could use any way of ticking. We have a good gun activity box and we have a bad gun activity box, and you can pick whichever one you want. If you're open to utilitarian arguments, then you just need to know where the numbers stack up and you can make your decision there. Right. Does that make sense?
No, I'm aware. But I just wanted to make sure you understood the difference of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about defensive uses versus deaths. I'm saying there are way, way more instances where a gun is presented as a form of self-defense where it's not necessarily used or fired. And that number far outweighs the number of gun deaths every year in just what's reported. And so in reality, one could make the argument that guns protect more than they cause harm. Mm-hmm. And again, like, if you are unwilling to look at that fact or you disregard it for whatever reason, then and you also, there are a lot of people that believe, well, how do we know those really happen, right? There's no tangible way to know that actually happened. If somebody calls that in, like, I pulled my gun and they ran, like, that could just be a lady in fucking Texas who likes making that call every Tuesday. But the point is you know, it's easy to sort of devil's advocate your way across a lot of these different types of issues. I think you have to do your best. The best you can do is say, what is the best possible outcome? What is the worst possible outcome? And which one is more worth fighting for? And that's the thing about the Chappelle special is, like, does it cause real world harm? I think it brings more joy than it causes real world harm.
I guess my question for you would be, are you of the opinion that people who have that conversation and everybody has access to the same information, so they're all looking at the same thing and the same data, do you think people could genuinely prefer different outcomes?
In which one? In the gun scenario or in the Chappelle scenario?
In either scenario, you're saying that we should look at these things and do the thing that's going to do the most good. For me, my feeling is that people could have all the same information and have different opinions on what would constitute the most good. And that those are kind of intractable differences of personality.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of getting into there are people that are inherently good and people that are inherently bad.
Well, not inherently good or inherently bad, but there are people who inherently have a high tolerance for risk combined with a high drive for self-preservation. And if you have those two things, then you might go like, gun is incredibly effective for defending myself, even if it's just showing to somebody that I have one and sending them on their way. And at the same time, I know the odds of dying in a mass shooting are extremely low. And in terms of my mental health, I have no interest in committing suicide. So when I add up all these things, the best way to live my life with my high self-preservation drive and my low fear of things that are very low risk, keep the guns. And if somebody has a different orientation, I don't see them coming out with that conclusion. So I don't know that you have to bring good and bad into it.
Yeah, but I think in that scenario, you're talking about something that ultimately boils down to freedom of choice. And so it's like, well, if somebody feels better having a gun for self-defense and somebody feels like they don't need it, then that's each individual's freedom of choice. Then you pick the thing that allows most people to do what they want. Like, forbidding somebody from owning one for the sake of the peace of mind it provides to someone who doesn't own one is a wash. One of those isn't societally better than the other. So to me, it's sort of like, which one allows the most amount of people the choice to do what makes them happy? Because owning a gun doesn't harm anyone. Right. And so that's where it boils down to. It's like, to me, the extent of law and what we govern should be about maximizing freedom and minimizing mass scale harm. But even the percentage of people that die in mass shootings comparative to, like, the percentage of people that die of heart disease every year, shutting down every McDonald's would be far more important than getting rid of guns. if we're talking about total real world harm. So
I'm assuming that, for example, I'm assuming all types of death are not equivalent to you, and that you, like most people who've had this conversation, there's ways that you would prefer dying over others. I think for many people, the surprise heart attack death or just the slow decline in health is preferable to being violently shot. I'm not saying I have that opinion.
No, I don't view one as better than the other. I mean,
really?
I don't because
that's an interesting trait.
Well, I haven't experienced either one. So how would I know? Like, I wouldn't know what a heart attack death feels like versus getting shot in the head. You might not feel getting shot in the head. I have no way of knowing.
But you understand that there's, or not understand, but it's like, so for example, you're familiar that there's a, the horror genre depends on there being categories of death that are scarier than other ways of dying. That there, if you were to make a horror movie and just pick types of death for your characters at random, there's a chance you're going to pick forms of death that in some ways are just, they don't scare that many people.
Maybe. Yeah, but there are some people who have tremendous fears of everyday things, right? Like there are some people like, so like, what is your number one? So we'll get a little bit into the questions. What would be the shittiest way to die in your mind?
Yeah, for me, if it's not too broad, it's just tortured to death.
Okay.
Really something that would have to do with like being flayed.
Yeah. So just anything that's like extended pain.
Long, slow, extended pain that, is able to reach those highest thresholds that a human nervous system is able to perceive as pain.
Okay. Right. That sounds like you put a significant amount of thought into that. Mine would be drowning. Mine would be drowning because I think ultimately you would feel responsible for it no matter what the circumstances were. And I feel like it's like the slowest moving train to death is drowning and knowing that it's happening while it's happening. Yeah. So that to me is the worst. Drowning or maybe being set on fire. Those would probably be the two worst.
Set on fire is probably my second.
Yeah, it's probably my second too. But I haven't experienced drowning but I will say this, like all of our fears in life of like what we're most afraid of, it all depends on our experiences. Like people talk about irrational fears. There's no such thing as an irrational fear because it's all rooted in something that happened at a young impressionable age that affects how we are. There are people that are perfectly fine with heights. I'm terrified of them. And it was because I was hung off an aircraft carrier as a child. Like I understand what causes these things or where they're sort of entrenched. And there's some that I don't remember why, but I have a feeling about something, whether it's a fear or something I'm into that goes back to something that happened to me when I was young. It's almost impossible to like safeguard the world against everybody's fears, against everybody's greatest fears. So to me, it's sort of like, what, and then the question is like, what is government's role in making laws, right? There's essentially the philosophical purpose of law historically has been to do three things: maintain order, settle disputes, and uphold some set of cultural morality that the tribe agrees upon, right? So in my mind, government's roles should never really extend beyond those three core things when it comes to what is legislated and what is written into law. And so like preventing murder, for instance, would be maintaining order, right? We have to keep people from killing each other because that's part of maintaining order. But determining who can marry who is not one of those things. So in my perspective, that's something government should play no part in.
I understand what you're saying. I haven't spent enough time thinking about those things to have a well-articulated answer. I would just say that my gut feel, or just my impression from some of those discussions, is that like a lot of times it's like it leaves out chain of event consequences. And I'm not talking in the sense of like anything could happen. So anything's connected in a chain, but there are some predictable chains that we have, say research on, that we see routinely. This is how a lot of things function, because there are actual patterns that we know when X and Y come together, this pretty reliably happens. And I think once you start thinking about some of the chains that can lead to bad things, that makes governance fairly complicated to me.
Yeah, but I think it is because it becomes very chicken and egg. Right. And so it's sort of like, the good example that I give for people all the time, or a good analogy that I give to people all the time about, you have to be very cautious about what you want government to do, because it ends up being a lot in what I refer to as the Matrix conundrum, which is that scene did you see the first Matrix movie? Many times. So there's a scene in the Matrix where he goes to visit the Oracle. She goes, "Don't worry about the vase." And he goes, "What vase?" And he turns and he knocks it over. And she says, "Now you're really going to rack your brain about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything." And so I think we have to be very, very careful about the power we give to government in creating the vase problem where it otherwise would not have existed. And so you have to be very, very cautious about it's sort of the idea of and a lot of libertarians believe this, is part of the reason why we have drug problems, because they were illegal in the first place. And there is this sort of sense of taboo and this sense of rebellion behind them. Whereas if we had never outlawed drugs, would there be drug problems in this country at all? It's very hard to go back and run it back and find out. But I think we have to be very, very cautious about our laws creating the vase scenario, where we are essentially creating a law that creates a problem that otherwise would not have existed without the law, without forbidding something. And I think that's why I'm definitely a minimalist when it comes to government intervention in terms of what happens in society. And I don't always think that government is the solution for the problems that we have in society. But I do think a lot of times, in more cases than not, they're attempting to fix things does not end up having the desired outcome. And I think what we're finding out more and more is that what's being presented as the desired goal isn't actually the goal. Right. And so it's sort of like sometimes the goal is to stay in power and to make a lot of money. I think that's the concern a lot of people have about vaccination being pushed down everybody's throats, is that, there's a lot of people making money as a result of this being mandated. And that is the cause for concern for people. If you eliminated that from the equation entirely, meaning the government officials who make these kinds of mandates or laws aren't allowed to participate in owning stock of these fucking companies, then you could get rid of that concern for a lot of people. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in.
So I am not that familiar with what the most popular motivations for being an anti-vaxxer are, despite my mom and several other relatives being virulently anti-vax. So I'm fine seating that, if you did certain things, then the people complaining about those things would be like, oh, well, now I trust this a little bit more because no one's getting rich just off me participating in it.
Well, so much of the hesitancy or the rebellion comes from the mandate. I mean, it's literally just a contrarian response to being told you have to. It's like when kids are told they have to go to bed. They don't want to do it, even though sleep is good for them.
Well, I will say that, how do I put it? It also feels to some degree distinctly American. I'm not saying that there's no other countries that
I don't disagree.
Individuality.
I don't disagree with you at all. I think that's very much that rebellious nature is very much an American trait.
Yeah. So it's a unique thing for us to deal with when I'm not saying that this is the thing. I'm not saying that there's 100% proof on this or that thing. I'm just saying hypothetically, in any situation where it does seem clear what the beneficial end is, if you are a government, you're in the position where you're supposed to tell people to do that thing. But if you're dealing with a distinctly rebellious population, then it's kind of well, this is always going to be an issue, even when you're saying things that seem clearly beneficial, if we're positing that people are always going to run and rebel against mandates.
Yeah, well, the data shows you that the overwhelming majority of Americans aren't rebelling against mandates. Now, that breaks out differently in certain subsets of culture, You know, for instance, in the black community, the numbers are way higher of people that are anti-vax than in the general American populace. And I think that comes from a greater mistrust of federal government. You know, and that's really what it boils down to. Like when I've had black guests on the show talk about vaccine hesitancy, that's the very first thing they'll bring up. There are more reasons to mistrust the government, and particularly along the lines of health related things, because when you look back at things like Tuskegee experiments or some of the other things that have been done historically without the black community's, you know, consent in terms of medical experimentation, there's a little bit more there. But I also just think we're trending in a direction where government is trusted less and the media is trusted less than it's ever been before, because more stuff is wide open and more people are capable of finding information that otherwise was harder to get historically. And so, like, when you look at things like Project Veritas and they have footage of somebody who works at one of these pharmaceutical companies telling you, don't get the vaccine, it doesn't work, and it really hasn't been tested, it's lending credibility to a lot of these suspicions that people have of, like, and then people are also doing a great job of, like, super cutting all the news programs and media programs that are sponsored by these companies and funded by these companies. And so I think it's fanning a lot of the smoke that was there before for people, where they're like, I just have this general sense of not trusting the government. And then things like that come out and lend credibility to that feeling. And I think there are more things that are being revealed every day that are lending credibility to people's mistrust of our government and the people in power. And that's going to continue to snowball regardless of which side is in office. It happened under Trump. It's now continuing to happen under Biden. And I think, you know, when I've predicted this many times, I don't think the Civil War will be white versus black in this country or right versus left. I think what ultimately will happen is that the people will band together and understand that this system of government is not working for anyone other than the people involved in it, and that will have to change. And I think that's inevitably when we come to a civil war in America. That's my belief. So
I have a particular experience with these things, and I'll say it's idiosyncratic to me. And I'm not saying that you can extrapolate from this to everyone else's experience, but I grew up with somebody who didn't trust, you know, she was a white, poor woman, and she didn't trust Western medicine. And so I got to grow up with all the old conspiracies one at a time. So I've grown up with, say, the lizard people one. I've grown up with anti-vax for a very long time. I've grown up with concerns over mercury or fluoride. I went through each of these and got to experience when each one had its day, and it was the biggest conspiracy for its moment among this group. And so for me, a lot of this reads as just the latest in a series of fixations among a group of people who, for whatever reason, have this distrust. I only know it on the poor side. I only got to experience it there. But at no time did they think each of these were equal. It was just always, oh, okay, this is the conspiracy right now. And this was not small for me. These were not things where people were just kind of dipping their toe in. I went untreated with asthma for 12 years. It wasn't until I almost died after upper respiratory infection at like age 12 made me lose like 20 pounds, which is quite a lot when you're 12. So I was around people who lived and died by these things. So for me, this is just one more fixation in that line. And what I would bring up, the reason why this is relevant to me, is that when I look at America and I compare it to the history of other countries, I've never seen, and no one's ever reported one to me, a country that is engaged in civil war that has a middle class as large as ours, a middle and upper class that has that many millions of people living in it at the same time who are enjoying that standard of living where we're still a top 10 country in the OECD. I have never seen anyone show a country with that many people at that income level above what you need for subsistence choosing to engage in the hell that is civil war. I don't know if you meant your civil war more metaphorically in terms of like actually, political and ideological battles rather than an actual physical conflict.
Well, it's not necessarily civil war so much as it's overthrowing, it would be a coup, essentially. It would be overthrowing the government. So I don't necessarily know if that is classified as civil war. But I think that's much more likely than a man versus man sort of civil war, battle of ideology in America between two sides of opposing viewpoints. I think what's more likely to happen is an overthrowing of our current system of government.
So for me, and maybe that's on the wings, and maybe I'm, being naive about this, but because of how my life is organized, the world where people describe politics in this way, and they're sort of minding what could potentially be on the horizon, still seems like a place that I can step out of, and that I can go walk into, like when I was substitute teaching in mostly middle-class areas throughout like the 2010s, where there are so many middle and upper class folks where like literally their whole life involves almost no politics, and they're not particularly concerned with any of this, and they're focused on like what their kids are doing, how their job is going, how their family is doing. And I can step back into that world. I know what restaurants or coffee shops or buildings or public institutions to go to just be around all the people who don't seem to be really losing any sleep over any of this. Even when you look at something like as glorious as like the New York Times will say, their subscribership is around like 5 million. Whenever we try to put like hard numbers on how many people are living and dying by these political discourses, at least in my research, I keep finding numbers that match my day-to-day experience, where it's like there's places where people are really, really into this and they're wondering when the Civil War will potentially break out. And there's other places where it's like, this is the American middle class and upper class and the wealthiest class that's ever existed on any country. And they're basically living lives that represent that, where they're mostly focused on their family, their friends. And when I look at like voting and how like most of our voting proceeds with, people saw Trump's victory and they tried to use that to diagnose what America was like. And then when you looked at the actual numbers, close to a third of Americans didn't even vote. And then another third didn't vote for Trump. And so people were willing to use Trump's presidency to characterize, some 200 million plus eligible voters. But if we were looking at that in terms of an actual survey, 1/3 didn't care and the other third was against. So technically 2/3 of Americans were either against Trump or not moved to. It would be insane to look at those events around Trump and diagnose the mood of the country. So for me, so many of these things seem like the political discourse is something you can step into and be surrounded by people who are really, really thinking, where's this going? And they feel as if all the Americans are participating in this debate. But for me right now, it still feels like the American middle class and upper middle and really upper class are chugging along and their lives are so comfortable that they're nowhere near wanting to engage in the strenuousness that a coup or an overthrow or a civil war would do, because like,
but those wars have never throughout history required their participation. I mean, they didn't participate in Vietnam. They didn't participate in the Civil War. They didn't participate in any of those things. I mean, which is why
I pointed out.
But it doesn't require their participation for it to happen, is my point. Like, you know what I mean? Like that, to your point, like whole regimes are changed with a minority of the American populace. And so when you talk about the people who don't vote, generally the people who don't vote are disenfranchised on both ends, meaning they're too poor to think it matters or they're too rich to think it matters, right? And so generally those people abstain from voting, but that doesn't mean that the shifts don't occur without their participation.
If you combine just those two groups that you named, you wouldn't equal a third of the country.
Right. So who makes up the rest of that third that doesn't vote? Middle class? Right. Upper and middle class. But my point is those who abstain from that political discourse it's like the people that choose not to participate in a revolution aren't necessarily subject to the effects of that revolution, or are just by existing enough to prevent it from happening.
And what I would point out there is, like, presumably there's a minimum number of people who need to be involved for it to work. For example, outside of, like, say, a movie situation, one revolutionary is probably not enough.
No.
There's some minimum number. As far as I know, and I haven't compared the numbers across countries, the numbers in countries that have had revolutions have such a large percentage of their population at the bottom of the income level. And I don't think when we look at that proportion and ask if America has that same proportion that we've hit it. And so for me, that would incline me to think until we hit a similar proportion of people who match these revolutionary proportions in other countries, we're probably not going that way. Just because I believe probably there's a minimum number of Americans who would need to participate in this. I might not be able to say what that exact number is.
Well, I mean, let's just look at how our government reacted to how many people showing up at the Capitol. I mean, they talk about that like it was the worst thing that ever happened in the history of America. How many people was it?
And that makes you feel like we're more inclined to have a successful coup?
I'm just saying it's not going to take a majority of the country to affect that. And by the way, if you look at this globally, it never does. Like those types of sort of violent shifts always happen with a well-organized minority, like a well-organized sort of radicalized minority group with the proper sort of either intelligence or military capabilities, right? And so, for instance, if one chamber of our military decides that the government needs to be overthrown, it doesn't fucking matter what everyone in Silicon Valley thinks. Like, if the Secretary of Defense gets the entire military behind an overthrow, it doesn't matter what the breakup of Americans is ideologically. Like that, again, like you're sort of proposing it being this groundswell of an idea. I think all it takes is the right chamber of our government or the right part of our government. Like perfect example is like, look at the number of people that decide policy and protocol for this country based on the size of this country. Less than 1,000 legislators determine what 330 million people have to do every day.
So what I would separate is like, I would separate what has typically been the way revolutions have done from what are ways revolutions could be done. It could be done with a very small number of people. That is possible. What has been done, what I would argue is that if we were to look up a list of countries that have experienced revolutions, I'd be willing to bet that when we look at that sizable minority of people who were the well-oiled machine, that it would be a pretty sizable minority. I'm thinking it would be somewhere in the 25 to 30% range at least. And I would also be willing to bet that there's other traits that are true about them. I would be willing to bet that many of them have a similar class background. I would be willing to bet that there's also other true things, like we're looking at a country where the military also has an ethnic connection, where say like certain people are always in control of the military. But there would be these other features. And I'm saying like if we were really meticulous about looking not at how it could be done, but how it has most often happened, we would see certain trends in certain proportions that I don't think are currently in the works in America.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a thing that's like, there are a lot of things about America that have never happened before elsewhere in the world. And so I just don't feel like this would be any different. I don't feel like that we are incapable of things happening differently here than they have happened throughout history. And I mean, we've been doing our own thing forever. And we've been changing the way things have historically been done around the world forever. So I do know this. I know that we have a very lazy, comfortable society. And it doesn't take a lot of people to take over a tribe of very lazy and comfortable people. Look at the animal kingdom. You know, one well-oiled lion can fuck up an entire Sahara of animals and completely change that ecosystem entirely. So it's sort of like,
why would we go to animals when we could use human examples?
Well, you can look at Hitler, right? Like Hitler was a guy who started in cafes and listen, a lot of the way that he rose to power was people like us sitting back and going, that's just this little fucking fringe group that's never going to be anything.
Yeah, but within the context of Germany, this is what I mean about being meticulous. He's in the midst of a French occupation post that he's got the massive surplus of impoverished people. He's got an occupied country. He's got a shared ethnicity. these are factors that I'm saying I would want to look for before I say like, oh, America's in the same position. If that makes sense.
But I think we are headed towards that way. I mean, look, there's a socioeconomic devastation from this pandemic shutdown that we still don't know the full ramifications of, because we're only 24 months, not even 24 months into it. So, you know, and with these further mandates and further, you know, in terms of like businesses and things like that, the full damage is not, we can't assess that yet. And so it's sort of like, do we have enough poor people to, you know, potentially lead to a revolution? I don't know if we know the answer to that yet, but it isn't trending in the right direction.
So,
because to me, that group is the disenfranchised. And right now, government, the American government, is using as much divisiveness as they can to remind those people what they don't share in common versus what they do share in common. So going back to your argument about thirds, if the 2/3 of the people that voted start to agree on shit, that's a real fucking problem for the government, right? If the people who voted on the left and the people who voted on the right decide to come together and recognize that they share a common enemy, that is a problem for the government.
Yeah, and I would say if there was a situation where we had 66% of Americans aligned and feeling disenfranchised, then a coup is completely possible. I'm just not seeing the evidence of, say, those numbers. And for me personally, I'm willing to say like there's enough information to make an assessment, and then there's not enough information to make an assessment. And if I don't think there is enough information, then I have no opinion.
Yeah.
As opposed to in some cases where people are like, well, I don't think there's enough information to make an assessment, therefore I still think this is going to happen. It's just not my bearing.
Yeah, for me, it's far more guttural. Like it's just in what, you know, being among people and listening to what people, how people are feeling about things in the world today. And that's a pretty diverse subset, by the way. Like, I'm not talking about speaking to one group with one set of ideologies and trying to extrapolate that. I'm talking about talking with people that are on the extreme left and talking with people that are on the extreme right, and finding a lot of commonality in their frustrations and a lot of commonality in their pain points, and a lot of people sort of starting to agree on things that they historically never did or never even came to the table to discuss. And so I think that is why you're seeing censorship and deplatforming and all of those things becoming more prevalent, is because I think government is recognizing that it is important, and that too many, again, one of the great examples I had was like, wait until like extreme right people and BLM unify under the idea that the government is fucking them both. That's going to be a real problem for, you know, for those in power.
And I think this is part of the difference. When you were talking about the two groups that were very diverse, you didn't mention the middle.
Well, the middle's not participating.
Yeah, and I do think there is a numbers game involved in the overthrow or the coup of anything. I also would bring up that very often there is a disconnect between belief and action. It's very, very common for people to have super strong beliefs and things that they're willing to complain about. But if we want to be, well, I always want to be, typically, the people who can engage in really, really, and I'm not saying the only coup that you imagine is a military one, but I'm just using this as an example. People have to be conditioned for it. They either have an experience where they live in a place that already has like war zones, warlords, and that sort of situation where violence to them is an option that they're comfortable with, or they're in a system like ours where we use boot camps. Well, first off, we let people self-select. So it's already the people who are somewhat open to the possibility of a kind of violence. And then we condition them to get them to the point where they'll engage. The majority of people talking they don't have that exposure to violence, and they haven't been through those sort of experiences. And even if I go away from the American military to the people who are like extreme and really, really into these things, they're even running their own people through, say, exercises to try and get them ready for that, because it's just a necessity. I'm saying that so many Americans, as far as I can see, even the ones who are very bellicose about their beliefs, they don't know that they don't even have the stomach for what it would take to engage in that sort of
but those people just stay home through the transfer of power. Like, their lack of participation isn't enough to stop the changing tides. Like, it's like it's a perfect example is the analogy you used earlier about those who stay home and choose not to vote. Even if the way the system works is, even if the majority of people don't show up to vote, let's say only 1/3 vote, the majority of those that do vote change the outcome. So it doesn't matter if there's an overwhelming lack of participation, unless those people are actually taking action to obstruct the changing. It doesn't matter. It's really about are there
the other thing we mentioned, which was enforcement.
Sure, but a good example is like there isn't military rule enforcing any of these mandates or anything around the country yet. They're just adhered to. Why?
Because it's within the comfort zone of this very, very large middle that I'm describing.
Right. And so what you're saying is that what would it take to push that group to action? Extreme discomfort, right?
I would assume.
Right. And so is it possible that might be headed our way now with the current systems that we have in place? And if that is not enough, how do we know that any regime change would cause them the same level of discomfort that would push them to action? My experience is that those people who don't react will continue to not react as the regimes change. They do it politically, and they'll just continue not to participate.
And you said that you come from a business and operations background. You may have a project, and depending on the size of that project, if let's say the project requires 15 people to be run. If you have 7 people, even if they're zealots, if your numbers are accurate, 7 zealots isn't enough to run the project because you need 15. That's the minimum. I'm saying at the size of our country, whatever regime change, for a regime change to matter, that means that there's new laws being written, there's new ways of doing things that are going to be done. This is a project of a certain scale. So there is a minimum number of people that you need to be on board to get whatever that project is done.
Not true, though. So I'll give you an example. So you're talking about a project versus directive, right? And so a project that might require participation, but perfect example is there were 9 or 10 people that sat on our board of directors. If they decide something for the entire company, that's the decision. So it takes a tremendous amount of action by that majority to subvert that decision. And what the experience I have is that most people won't organize. They won't take action. They'll take the path of least resistance. If another government, here's the scary, sad part about America. If another government came in and took over our government, the rest of America is not going to do a fucking thing about it. Most of America is just going to go, who's the new boss? All right, I guess I just got to do what they say. We're now China. Got it. Like, they're not going to do anything.
What I want to say is that this is where degrees and literalness do matter. That board of directors, whatever they were asking those people to do, I'm willing to bet that there were dozens, if not thousands, of comparisons to other companies in the same country all doing.
It could be a simple decision as this is what we'll do. This is what will help our stock in the next 6 months.
No, what I mean to say is, like, if there was an example of the board of directors comes in, has a bunch of American workers who are all working in offices right now, and they say, we're switching to sweatshop labor. We're doing that now. You're out of the cubicles and you're going to be working in the sweatshops. I don't think they would have retained those workers. I think because most of what they're asking, even if people bitch and moan about it, doesn't change their standard expectations of the home, the car they can afford, most parts of their life, the things that if we were to list and say, like, what really makes the bulk of your existence? Because what they're saying isn't changing that the way it changed from being a desk worker to a sweatshop worker, because it's not that extreme. Of course they accept it.
Right.
But so if I'm thinking of a coup or regime change, I'm expecting, if it's worthy of the name, I'm expecting a really, really disparate change.
Right. Yeah.
Or it's not even worth being called a coup.
Yeah, I think I just don't agree. I just don't think we're going to agree. And it's just as simple as, like, when forced with the decision to take a vaccine or lose your job, how many people took the vaccine? Most of them, right? Most of them. 70+% of people faced with that. 70+% of people faced with the possibility of it before it became a mandate did it. And now we have no idea how many people caved and did it after Biden said companies over 100.
I'm focusing on this gets back to just, very old Machiavellian level strategy that you are able, no matter, as long as you come in and you ask people to do the new subjects, this is basically what he wrote. As long as you're taking over and asking subjects to do something that's relatively the same as what they were doing before, it's an easy takeover. So the missing detail for me from what you just said is how many people were already comfortable vaccinating their children who were already vaccinated themselves, and thus being asked to be vaccinated again or lose their job was really already part of this train of normalcy where they're just like, the only difference here is you're asking me to do it, but I already have been vaccinated so many times. I got my children vaccinated, and vaccinations themselves aren't this huge break in normalcy for me.
Right. But we don't disagree about that. We don't disagree about that. Most of America is motivated by comfort. Like, all human beings are binary in the sense that they're motivated by one of two things: incentives or consequence. And for a lot of people, a lack of disruption to their routine is incentive enough to do something, whether they're morally compelled not to. My point is that a very radical mind, it's like the concept of herding cows. There could be 2,000 cows herded by a small number of herders because of the way a herd mentality works, or the way you can essentially control a herd of animals. It's no different than in America. A majority is not needed for that kind of radical change. It's just not. We have too many cows.
Well, you take cows, for example. It's very easy in that example that you're describing to have one person lead them in behaviors that are fairly common for them. I think it would be very difficult for one person to lead cows in a bunch of behaviors that are bizarre for them. Right. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but again, you're presuming a regime change would bring about a tremendous amount of discomfort. That might not be the case. There might not be a perceivable level of it might not be something that disrupts the majority of Americans.
Well, I would say for me, and this could be wrong, there's two things going in my head. One, if it's worthy of the name coup, regime change, it's probably drastic. And the other part is like, if this is a minority view, because we've been hypothesizing about a minority running this and being able to pull this off, to me, almost by definition, minority rule implies some sort of discomfort for the people, or they would have joined the viewpoint of the minority. If they were drawn to it, they'd be on the similar side. The fact that they haven't taken that view implies that there's some difference of opinion here between them and how they like to live their lives, and this very motivated minority that found the majority's way of doing things so unpleasant that they were moved to engage in the hard labor of it.
It's not necessarily about their way of doing things. It could be about their motivations of doing things, right? Like, I don't, and this is, I'll give you a good example of something you mentioned earlier. When I talked about people that are anti-COVID vaccine, you lump them in with the concept of being anti-vaccine. So what that does is it disregards the nuance that there are a lot of people that are anti the COVID vaccine that are otherwise pro-vaccine, have historically been vaccinated, and have no problems with vaccination. They have problems with this being classified as a vaccination when it hasn't been tested like other vaccinations, when it doesn't function like a traditional inoculation, in that it simulates a virus rather than introduce it to your body and train your body to kill it. There's a lot of nuance to that conversation. But immediately, your perception of that talking point was that, well, anti-vax people are anti-vaccine across the board, and I'll compare it to my personal experience with dealing with conspiracy theorists. So it went from somebody who is anti-COVID vaccine to then somebody who's generally anti-vax, and then your extrapolation from there was to people that are just generally conspiracy theorists. And the problem is that oftentimes those generalizations allow you to ignore the groundswell of people that are rallying around a common shared thing that expounds beyond that subset that you've identified. Now you're saying, well, there aren't enough conspiracy theorists to overthrow the government. And I'm saying, I'm not even talking about conspiracy theorists. I'm talking about people that are looking at government behavior from the last 24 months and have unified around the idea that this government can't be trusted and is only serving itself. And I can tell you that there are loud enough people from every group, liberal, center, independent, conservative, pro-BLM, pro-Antifa, Proud Boys, whatever, that are all starting to agree that this government exists only to serve itself. And so I think you have to be cautious about when you say, well, these are minority groups. I actually think it's a lot of minority groups that are finding common ground and agreeing on this new problem, which is that we have a government system that is looking to maintain power, increase their wealth and control, and not allow anybody else into the building to voice any sort of opposition. And so it's kind of like, and one of the concerning things about that is kind of what you highlighted in the article is when we start to look at the diversity of Congress, you're seeing the same things happen with the diversity of Hollywood. We're finding out that these people are not from the borough or from the barrio or from impoverished black neighborhoods. These are Ivy League educated, connected people of color that are part of the same system. And so I think you're looking at a lot of people starting to recognize, even if they're part of these different small groups, we'll call it like militias, eventually all the militias are going to start talking to each other on the internet and saying, we've got a common enemy in this corrupt government.
So I want to call out again that, and if I wasn't emphatic enough about it, that I should have been more emphatic, but I believe the word I used was that this was my own personal idiosyncratic experience of this particular thing.
Yeah.
I don't think that that should be used. The reason I called it out as idiosyncratic is like, I don't think it should be a model for everyone else. It was more like how these things hit me based on that experience. Yeah. The other thing I want to point out is that as far as I know, there's no large group of Americans on any issue where everyone within that group shares the same set of beliefs. If I was required to only describe groups by ideas that every single member held, I don't think we could describe any group. I don't think there is anything like that. So we're always dealing with the fact that groups have a core consensus and then people who hold various degrees of like different beliefs separate from that core consensus. And I don't think you could talk about any group if you could only mention the things that every single member agrees with. Going from that, I think when we're talking about groups, particularly groups we don't belong to, I can't really know everything that is in every single opinion or what all the breakdowns are for all the people involved in being anti-COVID vaccine. I just have, who are the people that most often get to speak for this? What is the general point being made? And I would say that in my experience thus far, and this is not a research area for me, so I just have the layman's experience of it. The spokespeople most often given a place to speak, they don't start their argument from how the COVID vaccine is different from other vaccines like this, and that I am generally in support of vaccines and whatnot. I have heard people make that argument. It's not the most common one that I think a layman encounters for that group. And it's
I think that depends on your circle as well. Like I would disagree and say the majority of my experience that of people that I interact with have that perspective. I'm not traditionally anti-vaccine. I have a problem with this one because. So we're coming from two very different perspectives.
Yeah, most of my intersection with this are for impoverished communities that generally are distrustful of medicine generally, and then middle and upper class communities that are very beholden to alternative forms of medicine for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, they're hippies, and they have the benefits of not necessarily being hit with disease the same way as other communities.
And then the last part that I would add to this is like, and maybe you do have some sort of survey numbers or something like this, but my understanding would be like, if we were trying to diagnose what the breakdown of these viewpoints are for any of these groups, it would stay speculation. It would stay, you have to refer anecdotally to who you've been around, because I don't think there is and maybe I'm wrong and you can correct me, I don't think there's some place where we can look to see like why most people are against the COVID vaccine.
Well, nobody wants to collect or share that data because it doesn't serve any purpose other than subverting the narratives that different sides want to push. For instance, like the left wants you to believe that everybody who doesn't want a COVID vaccine is a conspiracy theory Trump supporter. That's what they want you to believe. But that's not the facts. I mean, and there are a lot of people that are, I mean, here is the problem that I have with it. We're existing in a state in California where employers and academia and entertainment has said that we won't even allow for medical exemptions. So imagine you're somebody with an autoimmune condition who cannot be vaccinated, and they're telling you, we will not make an exception for you to participate in society. What do you do with that information? Now, just because that's a severe minority of people doesn't mean it's right. And it doesn't mean that people that don't experience that firsthand won't support those people in saying that it's not right.
What I would think from that, and I don't know exactly what you wanted me to get out of that reference, though, is like there's a multitude of responses.
What I wanted you to get out of it was there's one example of people who are vaccinated for a reason of not otherwise being or unable to be vaccinated, or anti-vax, as people like to call them, for only the specific reason that this is not something that they're able to participate in. They're not generally anti-vax across the board. They're not anti-government or anti-medicine across the board. So you asked me for an exception to those generalizations you made, and that's what I just provided.
Yeah. So my question would be, are you of the opinion, and this is not meant to be leading, are you of the opinion that if a person could come forward and say, due to my autoimmune disease, I can't get this vaccine, that the majority of the left and liberals, if they could sit down one-on-one with that person to hear that reason, they would be like, well.
We're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen. It's happening in SAG right now. Like, those people are presenting these medical exemptions, and SAG is telling them, we'll do our best to accommodate, but they're not getting hired for jobs.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is we don't give a shit because it doesn't affect the majority, right?
Well, wouldn't that, and again, you can add to this, if you're SAG and you're requesting that, presumably you're requesting it because you think the vaccine is necessary to stop the spread of this disease. So, I mean, if you don't believe that it's, if you don't believe these things, then there's really no reason to request it. You're in kind of an interesting situation. Then I would say if somebody comes along and it's like, I literally cannot get it,
right,
because of my autoimmune disease. Now you're in this situation where it's like, well, this person can't be made to get it, but we also believe that if we put them near people who are vaccinated, that we're still increasing the chance of the spread of this disease, which we're trying to maintain with this mandate.
But none of that's being investigated. Like, so much is happening without real conversations being had. And what I mean by that is, like, when you go to talk to people about why you can't be medically vaccinated, they'll just tell you that they've heard from either the media or the government or whoever. They'll just tell you, we've been told whether, and they won't tell you who tells them. They'll just go, we've been told there are no exceptions. So when your medical doctor is telling you that there are exceptions, and the person who governs whether or not you have a right to work or not is telling you there are no exceptions, what do you do with that information? And this is the thing, is like, you're talking about never in history has a minority overthrown and completely changed the culture of a country.
I didn't.
Okay. I didn't know that, because the Iranian Revolution is a perfect example. And what happened there was,
I said that there is a minimum necessary level.
Yeah, but it didn't take a lot. What happened was there were a lot of very comfortable, non-militarized, non-radicalized people who allowed themselves to be slaughtered by sitting by and not participating and not forecasting the threat to be as severe as it was.
Just to bring receipts on this, what was the population of Iran and what was the number of people who participated in the revolution?
Well, it's hard to put data to that because so many people did flee.
But
right, so what you're talking about?
Why assert?
But they didn't stay and fight and lose.
What I mean
So
if you don't have that information, why bring that up as evidence that you don't need a certain number of people? Why?
Well, you don't need a majority. You don't need a majority.
I don't think you need a majority. I think you need a minimum number that is larger than the amount available in America right now.
Right. So, and I bet I could provide it. I mean, I'm giving you that example just because I'm familiar with it. I don't have the exact numbers, but I can tell you it was not a majority of the population who overthrew that system of government in Iran in 1979.
No, I don't think you would need a majority of the population. I think, as I said earlier, that it would probably need to be something between 25 to say 35%, and that you would need these other factors such as an ethnic connection to the military, where you know the military is in the pocket of the revolutionaries, or you would need a very large number of the population to all be in poverty. Again, possibly that 35 to 40% would need to all be impoverished. And so looking at the Iran example, I would want to know how many people participated relative to the population. I would want to know the poverty levels, and I would want to know, does the military have an ethnic connection where like most of the poor are also most of the military?
Yeah, I mean, you're going back and looking at which percentage, and the other problem that the traditional, or that the, I guess you would call it the incumbent Iranian regime had at that time, was they had a religious separation amongst itself between Baha'is and Jews, versus the other side being united under an ideology of all being Islamic, all being Muslim. And so regardless of whether or not that was the majority or enough people, the other side was divided enough in their individual beliefs to where there wasn't necessarily unity in the majority, where the question of how to attack or defend against that was agreed upon, if that makes sense. And so, you know, the only, and this is the thing, is like a very small minority of people can affect massive change if the level of violence they're willing to commit is severe enough. So, you know, it's that's the thing, is like, to what level of violence would it take versus which percentage of people would it take?
And it's not just the violence. So it's like, again,
one person with a nuclear weapon that wants to do America harm is enough of a threat. That doesn't need to be, you know, a significant number of people.
If you're in a room where, for whatever reason, you're playing a betting game where you have to gamble on what the future of America is, you could have as one of the options held hostage by a single person with a nuclear weapon. But in setting the odds for that, I don't think that would be the highest odds outcome. And so it wouldn't necessarily be the one that I'd put my money on. And it's not the one that you're, as far as I know, putting your money on. You're putting your money more on this one having to do with civil war and a coup. And I'm saying, when we go to that one, there does seem to me to be ways of setting the odds on that through the collection of this different data. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, I just, again, like,
are you equally afraid of, not afraid, but do you think they have an equal chance of happening? One person with a nuclear weapon or civil war, are those all equal odds to you?
Yeah, I mean, well, if the Office of Naval Intelligence decides that Washington is now an enemy of the state, that's all it takes.
I'm not asking like how simple the process to get there is. I'm asking you what you think the likelihood is, and whether all of these are equal likelihoods.
I don't know. I think more in terms of what is the likelihood of a motivating event. So like it's sort of like, to me, saying what are the likelihood that it would happen is hard to say, because you'd have to first identify what would be a motivating event.